So it's the time when we should be having massive exports. Hi, CommStock channel. This is Matthew Kruse at CommStock Investments. I want to focus a little bit more on Brazil planting and what we see going on there in terms of weather. We're finally reaching kind of the back end of their planting season, and we see some potential weather risk in certain areas, and so I want to go over that with you. You've probably seen me show this slide before that the bulk of the planting in Brazil is really done between October 6th and November 23rd. And so I'm recording this now, it's November 18th. And so we're kind of in the middle of that window yet, but you kind of see it here in the red that they started out above average, for at least the first half of that season. And then we kind of got into the first part of November and things started to slow down. And a lot of that was due mostly in the south part of Brazil and Rio Grande do Sul. They've had a tremendous amount of precipitation. And it's just farmers there have kind of struggled to get that crop in. I think in case of Mato Grosso, most of it in the center west region, most of it has gone in on time. They are starting to fall behind overall. I don't necessarily believe that this means that the soybean yields due to the late planting will be negatively impacted because they do have a pretty long growing season, a little bit longer than ours. And so it could mean if there's a second crop of corn to follow it, that window might get reduced. But in the case of Rio Grande do Sul in the south, they don't plant near as much second crop corn. It's kind of either the first crop of corn or soybeans. And so they really just get mostly one crop in those areas. Maybe they'll do a second crop of sorghum, things like that. But I don't think that there's a huge risk because of this. I do see some potential weather impacts, and I'll go over that here. But looking at where we've been at for the last 5 days of precipitation in Brazil, you can see how it's been really concentrated here in kind of this region of Paraná, Mato Grosso do Sul, kind of this bottom half of Mato Grosso and the western half of Mato Grosso. As you head further east, those have been the areas that have been wanting a little bit more. Now this is going to shift here looking forward. We're going to see rainfall fill in here in this northeast region. Those have been kind of the areas that have been lacking the most in this Mapitobá region or Mato Piba, depending on how you want to say it, in Bahia, Tocantins, Piauí, Maranhão, these areas. We do see kind of a dry pocket here in this third week of November. It gets kind of the southeast area of Mato Grosso, Goiás, maybe even a sliver here of Minas Gerais, which is a little bit unusual, but we're not too alarmed by that just because a lot of those areas have good rainfall up until now. And so I think they've built up a little bit of a soil moisture profile. But going on into next week, we see those areas fill in. So this is those dry pockets that I showed you. And it looks like most of this getting, 2 inches on the low end to some of these darker areas are getting up to 6 inches. So you see here in Minas Gerais, this area of Goiás and eastern Mato Grosso, there's going to be pockets that are going to get up to 6 inches here by the end of November. Now, what the shift that I want to point out is that we are seeing a slow shift here as we head into December, where all that rain kind of sticks to the northern tier of Brazil, which if you've been following our videos and our CommStock report, where we've been talking about how that's really a classic La Niña climatic pattern. And so you kind of see in here in this portion of Argentina in the south, you're seeing virtually nothing in those areas. You see a little bit yet, maybe a quarter inch in pockets of Rio Grande do Sul, but there's pockets that in Paraná that don't get anything. And so that's what we're kind of concerned about and looking at going forward. Now, Rio Grande do Sul might not be a very large producing state. I think they produce about 22 million metric tons, more or less. Paraguay is also at risk. They produce a good 10 million metric tons. Argentina can produce 50 to 60 million metric tons. Now, if you add up a loss there, 20 to 30%, now it starts to become interesting. If you target this whole area, if you want to throw out a 30% yield loss due to potential La Niña damage, now you're talking, as much as 25 million metric tons, which is almost a billion bushels, or a little less, 900 million bushels or so. Now, this is all yet to be seen, but just kind of, wanting to point out some of these risk factors. Now, someone might point out, well, some of this could be offset in other areas. And that's true. And we've seen that happen in the past where, maybe they lose 6 million metric tons in Rio Grande do Sul, but pick up 2 or 3 in Mato Grosso or Goiás or other areas. And so that could help soften the blow. But this is the 10-day weather anomaly looking out here through the end of November. And you kind of see that this dry pattern especially impacts Rio Grande do Sul, parts of Paraguay, and then kind of filters over into Argentina. And the longer this goes on, getting out into December, like the more distinguished that dry pattern becomes. And so that's what we're seeing here. And I think the real problem is a lot of these farmers might get caught here that it's been too wet in Rio Grande do Sul to get the crop in. And so they've been waiting, and now it's going to dry out, and they're finally going to go in, and then it's not going to rain again. Yeah, which is about the worst possible thing that can happen. So they could get a horrible stand if they don't get the rains that follow. But for the most part, there's a dry pocket here and in Sao Paulo and part of Mato Grosso do Sul, but most of these areas in the north are getting pretty good rainfall. It looks like, at least through the end of the month. Looking at overall production and acreage expansion, this is in billion bushels. What shows you in the green, what shows you the overall crop is done. And so they're projecting a 6.5 billion bushel crop here. CONAB is for the 25-26 season. That is over 50% more than our U.S. crop that came in at 4.2 billion bushels. And so they continue to grow and expand regardless, it seems, of what we do here. And this is the number of acres in this gold line that's been increased accordingly. You kind of see the years where the green surpasses the gold line. They're kind of the years where they had really good yields, it seems like, and that kind of really helped get a bumper crop. And you kind of see that last year, especially in the 22-23 season, and they're projecting that again this year. Now, I've highlighted in previous videos, I think they're getting a little bit ahead of themselves because I think they're targeting about a 54 bushels per acre average, right, over that entire 121 million acres. Now, I would tell you that's very hard to do, especially when you're bringing in new production every year. However, they did it last year, and so I was proven wrong last year. However, they had virtually near perfect ideal weather across the entire country, which is very unusual. Usually there's a dry pocket or some sort of inclimatic weather someplace, and I don't know that they can, I guess, strike gold twice in the same place. And so that's essentially what I'm looking for. I think they maybe I think the acres might be a little bit overstated. I think their yield is overstated, and so I think with some inclimatic weather in the south, you could see that production come off by quite a bit. I'm going to shift and focus on kind of the most recent November USDA supply demand report that came out last week. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight in the case of the soybeans is how well our crushing capacity has really been probably helped supporting the soybean market to a certain extent. You can kind of see in the blue what our annual crush for soybeans has done. It kind of flattened here in this during the COVID years, it seems like the 19 to 22 period. But since then, it's really started to take off, and to a certain extent has been helping offset some of that loss. But what I really want to show is how exports and crush are basically going in the opposite direction, which probably shouldn't come as any big surprise in the case of the exports. Now, this here forecast for 1.45 billion bushels here in the soybean exports, that is just my estimation. The USDA is a little bit higher than that, 1.6 billion bushels, but this is taking into account, the first question you're going to ask is, was that taking into account this recent purchase of Chinese imports of U.S. soybeans? And yes, it does. And so the market is getting real excited that China's back and buying again. We're starting to get confirmation of that. But even so, based off of those targets that they've committed to in the trade deal, it still falls short of what the USDA had projected, and that's why I kind of show that here. Now to a certain extent, the crushing is good news. It does offset that a little bit, but I don't know. It's not going to completely offset it enough, but it does help. And so I just thought that was interesting. This is something important that I think if we can continue to invest our money and capital in our own domestic consumption and kind of wean ourselves off of China a little bit more. I know we just got done doing this trade deal, but I still don't see a long, multi-decade future with China, and I don't like the idea of relying on them anymore just because of some of the political issues that we face with them, and we have other issues with the rare earth minerals that I think there's a lot of potential for friction in the future. And so if we can continue to develop kind of our own domestic consumption and some of those renewable diesel fuel, I think we'll be much better off. It doesn't mean that the exports have to continue to drop, but I don't think that we can always rely on them going back up, in that 2021 year where we were at 2.2 billion bushels. They're probably going to more or less trade sideways, stay flat at these levels, but I think that we can continue to crush more. We'll be better off for that. These are numbers of the USDA November balance sheet that they came with last week, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that stuck out to me that I don't know that we talked enough about. It is important to point out that they did make a major adjustment here where they reduced feed demand from old crop, the 24-25 season. They reduced it by a little over 180 million bushels. And that's where we saw an increase then in ending stock that carried over into the following year. Now, my question is, from the 23 to 24 season, we came in at 5.8 billion bushels. They reduced it to then just under 5.5 billion bushels. Now, they still have a near record 6.1 billion bushels. So my question is, if we know that cattle herd numbers are down, why would we, be open to still hitting that 6.1 billion bushel demand for feed? And so I feel like the feed demand is overstated and could come down quite a bit. Even putting it back, I play with some numbers here, even putting it back down to this 5.8 billion bushels, what we had back in the 23-24 season, it makes a pretty big difference to the bottom line. But the other changes, obviously, that they had, everyone was hyper-focused on yield, where they reduced it by 0.7 of a bushel. And that's, we get our carry-in of over 207 million bushels from the reduction in the feed demand from last year. Offsetting the lack in production, we reduced total supply by this amount. 18.3 billion bushels is what we're starting out with our total supply. Now, they offset a lot of that because they increased exports. It is true that our corn exports are doing very well. They're off to a good start. It's still early. Some might say the USDA is getting a little bit ahead of themselves, and that could be. But they did increase the corn exports by 100 million bushels. And that's how they got to this number. Now, looking out, here for the future, I think a lot of people were disappointed. Maybe farmers were expecting USDA to come in at a lower amount. And so let's play with some of these numbers. Let's do that. Now, let's say it drops to 184 bushels per acre in the corn yield, and I reduce feed demand by 300 million bushels, which I think is a fair estimate considering what the USDA just did from last crop. It took them a while to do it. We still see ending stocks increase from this 2.1 to 2.2 billion bushels. Now, I even had some people say, well, they're going to cut yield, but they're going to find more acres, maybe as much as 250,000, maybe, 500,000, something like that. So if we increase that to 90.5 million acres for harvested acres, that takes us to this 2.355. Now, some people say, oh no, yield is still too high. Let's take it down to 182. This is kind of where we're at. So this is basically what I'm trying to say is the USDA still has ways to kind of manipulate this. Maybe that's not a fair word to say, but play around with it and change the numbers. That just because cutting yield doesn't mean the ending stocks necessarily have to get all that better, which is really what we should be more focused on, isn't just the yield, right? Because they can play with the numbers in other areas. And so that's what I would argue on the case of the corn. In the case of the soybeans, here you see where they reduced the November yield to 53 bushels per acre. They made some adjustments to old crop as well, not as large, but that's how we get this carry in of 316 million bushels. Overall, reduced total supply by 48 million bushels. Now, this, of course, was interesting where we bear in mind, we just got done or just announced a trade deal with China. And what does the USDA do? They reduce exports 50 million bushels. So how do you reduce the exports, based off of the fact that the USDA knows we just got this big trade deal done with China? It's basically because they're seeing the same numbers that we are, and they're thinking, well, even if China does ultimately buy what they agreed to buy, it still doesn't reach their estimates, for that year. And that's the difference that we came with. They reduced it from 1.85 to 1.63 billion bushels. And in my kind of alternative here, I'm reducing that down to 1.45 billion bushels. Now, we're just playing with these numbers. Obviously, these aren't set in stone yet. But, in this scenario where we're reducing yield, you get down to 290 million bushels, which is it's not super tight, but starting to get a little bit of tight there. But they're based off of, even taking consideration the improved crush that I just pointed out on a different slide. It doesn't kind of dig us out of this hole. We need exports to improve. And the fact we've just lost too much market share in this year, and too much time has gone by, and I don't see how we can make it up in the short amount of time that we have. We're in the kind of the peak season right now, where Brazil doesn't have their beans, and so it's the time when we should be having massive exports, and instead the opposite is happening. And then you take into consideration that, especially because of this rally, our beans are more expensive than Brazilian beans right now. And so that kind of disincentivizes China from buying a lot more. But so I see this scenario where the USDA is kind of forced to slowly, not all at once, but slowly reduce their soybean exports. And that's what sends us up here to 477. Now you can say, 53 bushels per acre, that's still too high. Okay, let's reduce it to 52 and a half. Well, it helps, but it's still 437 million bushel ending stocks still isn't that great. So that's kind of the situation, the risk that we see, and why we think that kind of the soybean rally is still a little bit overdone at this point, and we need further confirmation of China to step in and continually buy a lot more beans for us to kind of sustain this rally. That's all I have for you today. Thank you and have a good day.
Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.